By the time I reached Corridor C, the walls were already breathing frost. I don't mean they were cold, I mean they exhaled. White plumes pushed from the seams between insulated panels in slow, deliberate breaths, as if something immense had settled inside the facility and was learning the shape of lungs. Every light overhead had gone the color of old teeth. The emergency strips along the floor pulsed dim red through a skin of ice. Marek stood at the far end of the hall with his head bent at an angle no tired man would ever choose. One hand rested on the wall. The other tapped softly against it. Not random, a pattern. Behind him, all through the corridor, the knocking answered back. From the walls, from the ceiling, from the vents above me, from the floor under my boots. I kept moving because I had learned too late, and that stillness was an invitation. "Evan," Marek said, though his mouth barely moved, "you can stop now." His voice came a second time from inside the wall beside my shoulder, then a third time from the vent above me, warmer, closer, intimate enough to make my stomach drop. "We know what you signed," it whispered. "We know what happened to Caleb." The frost on the observation window thickened, and a face pressed outward from the other side, not on the glass, inside it. I ran, 48 hours earlier. I took the job because no one else would. That was the story I told myself on the drive north anyway. It sounded cleaner than the truth. The truth was that I needed a place no one reasonable would think to look for me. And the Halcyon Ridge cold weather testing facility had all the right qualities. Remote, private, well-funded, and vague enough on paper to suggest either government contracts or the kind of corporate work no one could discuss without initials. The listing had been 6 lines long: night operations technician, extreme environment facility, housing included, competitive pay. Prior cold systems experience preferred, discretion required. I had experience technically. I had spent 4 years pretending to be better at environmental systems engineering than I actually was, and in the startup world, that counted for more than it should have. You learned enough vocabulary to sound indispensable in meetings. You stayed one step ahead of the people who wrote the checks. You let the real engineers cover the gaps until they couldn't anymore, then one of those gaps split open. A pressure manifold in a prototype thermal housing ruptured during a private demonstration in Albany. The report said a sensor fault caused the failure. The report also had my initials on a safety verification line I never should have signed. One junior engineer died in the hospital the next day. Caleb Wynn, 24, engaged, liked black coffee and terrible synth music, and believed me when I told him the pod was stable. When investors started asking questions after the lawsuit, I stopped answering my phone. 2 weeks later, I was driving through a white landscape so empty it looked erased, following GPS directions that lost signal 30 miles before I reached the final turn. The facility appeared without drama. No gates rose from the snow. No floodlights swept the ground. It simply emerged from the weather, in a cluster of low concrete structures hunkered into the earth like something trying not to be seen. Long enclosed corridors connected the buildings. Every exposed surface carried a pale crust that I first took for rime ice. It wasn't. When I got out of the truck, the ground gave slightly under my boots, not soft like snow, but brittle and fibrous, as if frost had grown upward in layers from the soil and died there in place. It reached in pale ridges beyond the floodlit perimeter and vanished into the dark. Inside, the air smelled metallic and dry. Not hospital clean exactly, cleaner than that. Air that had been scrubbed until it lost any trace of weather or human use. A woman in a charcoal sweater met me at the reception. Mid-50s, close-cropped gray hair, no visible patience. Her badge read Shaw, Site Operations. "You're Mercer," she said. "Evan Mercer." She looked me over with the detached concentration people use on equipment. "You came alone?" It was a strange question, but then most of the drive had put me in the mood to accept strange things if they were said with enough administrative confidence. Was I supposed to bring someone? No, she said. Good. She handed me a temporary badge and a key card on a retractable clip. Cell service is unreliable. The internet is restricted. The dormitory wing is on surface level A. Testing access is limited to assigned corridors. The sublevel is off limits unless escorted. She said the last part with just enough weight that I asked, "What's in the sublevel?" "Storage." "What kind?" She had already turned away. "The kind you don't need." That should have bothered me more than it did. But I had spent enough time in half-legal production spaces to know that mysterious storage usually meant proprietary materials, not ghosts. My standards for suspicious workplace culture had become elastic. She walked me through a compact orientation room with a bolted-down table and a monitor playing a silent loop of safety procedures. Thermal suits, emergency blankets, de-icing protocols, eye wash stations. Corporate visual language, blue icons, friendly arrows. The sort of thing meant to reassure people that risk had been domesticated into a checklist. The facility, Shaw explained, was divided into 3 primary operational zones. The surface wing housed offices, bunks, a kitchen, a medical room, and an admin. The testing chambers occupied the center block, each a set of reinforced rooms used to simulate severe cold conditions for materials, machinery, and components under contract. The sublevel vault sat beneath the oldest section of the complex and held restricted inventory. Restricted how? Need to know. I smiled a little, trying for easygoing. I've signed NDAs before. This isn't about paperwork. She slid a single sheet across the table. Typed night protocols, it said at the top. Below were 4 rules. Rule 1. Never remain alone in a testing chamber for more than 10 minutes. Rule 2. If you hear knocking inside insulated walls, report it. Do not investigate. Rule 3. If temperatures drop below the set threshold without command, evacuate immediately. Rule 4. Always maintain visual contact with your assigned partner during night shifts. I read them twice, waiting for the punchline. That's it, I said. That's what you need. It feels a little theatrical. Shaw looked at me without blinking. It isn't. I had already made up my mind that it was. Not supernatural theatrical, just remote facility theatrical. The kind of weirdness institutions develop when they're understaffed, overfunded, and too isolated for normal habits to survive. Who's my partner? Marek Gorski, senior night technician. Senior makes him sound important. He is important if you'd like to finish your first week. Then, almost as an afterthought, she added, if Marek tells you to do something, you do it immediately. Don't debate. That amused me. I nodded as I understood, but privately I filed it under the rest of the facility's culture. Strict hierarchy, ritualized caution, fear disguised as professionalism. At dinner, I met Marek in the canteen. He was younger than I expected, maybe late 30s, broad-shouldered, with a narrow face that had been thinned further by the climate or the work. He wore his ID badge turned backward. He didn't offer a handshake. You're Mercer, he said. Everyone here says my last name like they're checking inventory. He didn't smile. You read the rules? Yeah. And I've worked enough bad jobs to know HR writes rules for worst-case lawsuits. His eyes lifted to mine. They were pale, colorless in the fluorescent light, and something was exhausting about the way he held eye contact. Not aggressive, just deeply practiced, like he never allowed himself to drift. Here, he said, the worst case doesn't make it into the paperwork. I laughed because I still thought he was trying to haze me. That night, from my bunk in Surface A, I listened to the wind rub against the outer walls and told myself I had gotten lucky. The room was warm. The pay deposit had already cleared. No one here cared who I had been before I arrived. No one had asked about Albany or Caleb or the names that had accumulated in my voicemail like threats in polite clothing. Outside my window, floodlights shone over the pale ground, and for 1 second I had the odd impression that the frost beyond the perimeter had shifted position, as if several ridges had leaned closer to the building while I looked away. I blamed exhaustion. I slept well. That was the first mistake that felt like luck. The first few nights made it embarrassingly easy to feel superior. Halcyon's night shift ran from 7 in the evening until 7 in the morning. The days belonged to admin staff, a contract engineers, and a rotating cluster of specialists who flew in when one of the company's funding places wanted a live test. Nights were mostly maintenance, diagnostics, recalibration, and data logging. Quiet work. Methodical work. Work that depended more on repetition than brilliance, which suited me fine. Marek and I made a loop every hour through the testing wing. There were 6 main chambers, each the size of a shipping container, with reinforced doors, internal climate controls, viewing ports thick enough to distort the light behind them, and sensor arrays feeding back into the central control room. Chamber 1 handled mechanical stress tests. 2 and 3 were general environmental simulations. 4 had been locked since my arrival. 5 and 6 housed materials racks and a cluster of experimental units, but no one bothered to explain to me. The job on paper was simple: check pressures, verify seals, reset ice accumulation sensors, record discrepancies. If a chamber deviated from the program, log the deviation and notify Shaw. If the internal temperature drops below the command set point without authorization, evacuate the wing and seal the corridor doors. Have you ever had to actually evacuate? I asked Marek on my second shift. Yes. What happened? He adjusted a valve readout without looking at me. We evacuated. I started learning what sort of conversationalist he was after that. Still, routine has a way of making every strange thing look procedural. Marek carried a small analog timer clipped to his belt and set it each time one of us entered a chamber, even if both of us were going in together. But he insisted on standing where he could see me through the doorway if I had to inspect a back wall or ceiling manifold. When we passed reflective surfaces, viewing windows, stainless steel cabinets, black monitor screens gone dark, he either avoided them entirely or looked into them with hard, focused attention, as if waiting to verify something. I noticed all of it, and because I am exactly the sort of man who mistakes nervous habits in others for proof of his own steadiness, I let it flatter me. There was something almost comic about how religiously he followed the rules. If he stepped into a chamber to swap a sensor and I stopped in the hall to review a clipboard, he'd call me in until we were again within direct sight of each other. If I turned down a side passage to fetch a tool without warning him, he'd come after me within seconds. Be not angry, just immediate. You can relax, I told him once. No. You say that like it's a complete sentence. It is here. That sort of thing should have unsettled me. Instead, it became part of the environment, like the persistent hum in the insulated walls or the fact that the air felt subtly colder near certain door frames even when the gauges said otherwise. The anomalies, when they came, were small enough to dismiss. On the third night, while we were recalibrating Chamber 2, I heard what sounded like fingernails on metal from somewhere behind the rear paneling. A dry, delicate scrape. I looked up. You hear that? Marek had already stopped writing. How long? How long what? The sound. It was like 2 seconds. He checked his watch, then the thermometer on the inner wall. Log it. That's it? That's it. No drama. No sprinting for exits, no alarms. He wrote wall noise, CH2 2114 in block letters, and moved on. An hour later, in the control room, I found the incident report tagged and archived without comment. On the fourth night, I caught sight of movement through the viewing glass of Chamber 5. Not a person, more like a lag in the air, a subtle distortion crossing the far wall after Marek had already shut the chamber down for the night. I mentioned it. "Condensation gradients," he said. "You didn't even look." "I've looked before." There was a confidence in that answer I almost admired. The facility had, in his mind, a complete grammar. Everything meant something. Everything had a proper response. He wasn't scared, I told myself. He was conditioned. Shaw was no better. The few times she crossed paths with us at night, and she moved through the corridors with the same compact, disciplined calm she'd had on my first day, as if nothing here could surprise her anymore. Once I asked why Chamber 4 remained locked. "Structural instability," she said. "In the chamber?" "In the answers." Then she walked off. I started sleeping during daylight with the heavy, uncomplicated exhaustion of a man who believes he has found a manageable life. The checks cleared on time. The work was repetitive enough that I could perform competently without much strain. I told myself I would stay a month, maybe 2, until the worst of the fallout back south cooled down. Then I'd take the money and disappear someplace warmer. On my 5th night, that confidence reached the point where it became contempt. We were doing a late pressure review in Chamber 3, one of the larger rooms. I set up with modular racks and a suspended manifold array that looked like a steel spine running along the ceiling. The chamber was inactive, ambient low but safe, maybe 10 degrees Fahrenheit inside. Marek crouched by a floor access panel, frowned at a pressure reading, and said he needed to check a valve in the adjoining service corridor. 2 minutes, he told me. "I'll try not to get eaten by insulation." He looked up sharply. "If I'm not back before the timer—" "I know, step out too. 10 minutes. "It isn't about memorizing it." "Then what is it about?" He held my gaze for a second too long. "Do not let yourself become the only living thing in the room." Then he left. I remember grinning after the door shut, not because what he said frightened me, and because it sounded ridiculous enough to confirm every private judgment I had made about the place. Halcyon, I decided, was one more institution held together by ritual and secrecy. Maybe someone had died here once. Maybe a contractor had frozen in a chamber, and now there were rules. That was all. I glanced at the analog timer clipped temporarily to the inner handle. I watched it tick down as I checked the manifold bolts, then lost interest and moved to a side console. There was nothing in the chamber but the light mechanical hum of inactive systems and the occasional crisp crack from metal adjusting to temperature. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Nothing happened. No drop in temperature, no strange sounds, no whispering walls, no sudden revelation that the universe had claws hidden in its corners. At 11 minutes, I laughed softly to myself. At 12, I was still alone. At 15, I realized something had gone wrong, not with the chamber, with Marek. The timer had already gone silent by then, a discreet little mechanical chime swallowed by the chamber's insulated hush. I stared at it, then at the closed door, and felt the first small, unreasonable crease open in my confidence. Because I had broken the rule, and apparently by the rule had decided to wait. I told myself Marek had been delayed by something ordinary, a stuck valve, a jammed hatch. One of those weird over-engineered systems remote facilities collect like scar tissue. I set my clipboard down, crossed to the door, and listened before opening it. Silence. Not total silence. The facility was never truly quiet, but corridor silence. Distant airflow, the low electrical drone in the lights, in somewhere far off the metallic contraction of pipes. No footsteps, no voices. Marek? Nothing. The service corridor outside Chamber 3 ran left toward the manifold controls and right toward the central access spine. Empty both ways. The light strips overhead cast a flat yellow-white glow over the gray walls. For a moment I was annoyed more than worried. He had made such a production out of never leaving each other alone that his own disappearance felt irritatingly hypocritical. I stepped out, letting the chamber door seal behind me, and checked my watch. 17 minutes since he'd left. There was a maintenance station just ahead, a recessed cabinet holding tools, spare sensor housings, emergency blankets, and a wall phone that looked old enough to have been salvaged from a decommissioned ship. I picked up the receiver. He pressed for control and waited through 2 clicks and a burst of static. No answer. That bothered me more. Night shifts at Halcyon ran lean, but someone was always in control. If not Shaw, then a technician monitoring environmental programs. I tried again. Still nothing. The corridor felt subtly different then, though I couldn't have said how. Not colder exactly, more attentive. The kind of sensation you get stepping into a room after people have been talking about you and have only just gone quiet. I moved left first toward the valve annex. The corridor narrowed there, lined with insulated panels broken by access hatches and status displays. Most of the displays showed green. One flickered between green and blank, in a rhythm just off enough to catch the eye. Beside it, a crust of white had formed around the edge of a sealed panel. I crouched automatically, put my fingers near it, then stopped. The frost was on the wrong side. It had spread outward over the corridor-facing surface, feathering from the seam in delicate branching lines. The panel housed a warm water pressure conduit. It should have been the least likely spot in the wing to gather ice. Marek? This time I thought I heard something, not an answer. A movement further down, a shoe scraping lightly. I rounded the bend and saw him at the far end of the hall, maybe 20 feet away, standing with one shoulder almost touching the wall, facing it. I let out a breath I didn't know I'd been holding. Jesus! There you are! He didn't move. What are you doing? Still nothing, and I walked toward him with the mix of relief and irritation that makes you careless. Halfway there, I noticed how stiffly he was holding himself. Not frozen. People use that word too easily. He looked braced, like a man listening at a door while trying not to be noticed on the other side of it. Marek. I was close enough now to see the muscles in his jaw twitch once. Hey. I reached for his shoulder. The second my hand touched him, his whole body jerked with such violent surprise that I stumbled back. He inhaled sharply, not like I had frightened him, but like he had been underwater and only just broken the surface. Then he turned. If you had asked me later what exactly was wrong with his face, I wouldn't have been able to give you a clean answer. That was part of why it took me so long to trust my own fear. Everything was normal in pieces. Skin tone, expression, pupils, mouth, nothing distorted, nothing theatrical. But his eyes moved too late. His head turned first and his gaze followed a fraction of a second after, sliding into alignment with me as if some mechanism behind them had lagged. It was such a small delay that I might have dismissed it if the rest of him hadn't gone so still. You stayed too long, he said. He didn't sound angry. He didn't even sound worried. He sounded like a man reading a measurement off a screen. What? In the chamber. I was waiting for you. Where the hell did you go? He looked past me toward chamber 3. It noticed. Something cold moved through my stomach then. Not supernatural dread yet, just the unpleasant awareness that the person in front of me might be having some kind of episode. Marek, are you okay? No answer. He stepped around me and began walking back toward the chamber with an unhurried, even pace. I turned to keep up. Hey, stop. What noticed? He kept going. That was when I heard the first knock. Soft, hollow, 3 taps in a measured rhythm. It came from the wall beside us. I stopped so abruptly that my shoulder brushed the insulated panel. Another 3 knocks sounded, not loud, not violent, just precise, almost polite. Tap, tap, tap. I stared at the wall. It was impossible to judge depth through the insulation. Halcyon's corridors had been built like bunkers. Thick inner foam, composite shell, service channels, layered reinforcement. The sound should have been deadened. Instead, it came through with intimate clarity, as though whatever made it stood inches away on the other side. Marek. He didn't look at me. In "Do not investigate." The wording was so exact, so perfectly lifted from the typed rule sheet that my fear twisted into anger. This is what you people do? Pipe noises into the walls to scare new hires? He stopped walking. I instantly wished I had kept my mouth shut. Slowly, without turning, he said, "If it knocks once, log it. If it knocks twice, leave the corridor. If it follows your pace, run." I felt something inside me shift at that. That's not one of the rules. No. He resumed walking. Those are older. The wall knocked again. This time is ahead of us. Same rhythm. Tap, tap, tap. Then from behind me, answering like an echo from another room. Tap, tap, tap. I backed toward the center of the corridor without meaning to. My mouth had gone dry. Every rational explanation I reached for, expanding pipework, pressure equalization, or some stupid initiation prank, fell apart against the simple, undeniable wrongness of the timing. The sounds were too responsive, too placed. Marek reached Chamber 3 and stood by the sealed door waiting for me with his hand on the access pad. "Come here," he said. I didn't move. Another knock, close enough that I felt it through the sole of my boot. Not the wall this time, the floor. I crossed the corridor fast, trying not to make it obvious that I was no longer pretending. Marek opened the chamber and pulled me in. The door shut behind us with a thick mechanical seal. For a few seconds, we both stood listening. Nothing. The chamber was still. The timer hung from the inner handle where I'd left it. The manifold overhead ticked quietly. The air was cold and ordinary and empty. I rounded on him. What the hell was that? He stared at the far wall instead of answering. "You'll need to make a report. I need you to stop talking like this is normal." His jaw tightened. "It's not normal, it's recurring. There are moments when fear arrives not as panic, but as a humiliating awareness that you have been the stupidest person in the room for much longer than you realized." Standing there in Chamber 3 with the old timer cooling in my palm and the memory of those soft knocks still moving through my nerves, I had the first taste of that awareness. I still didn't believe in anything supernatural, but I stopped believing the rules were a joke. That was enough to make the rest possible. I made the report because Marek insisted, though report implied a level of institutional seriousness the process did not deserve. Back in control, Shaw took my statement without surprise. She sat at the terminal nearest the environmental feeds, hands folded, listening with the expression of someone confirming the weather. I told her about Marek leaving, the missed timer, finding him in the corridor, and the knocks in the wall and floor. I left out the part where I'd accused them of hazing me. Pride survives longer than common sense. When I finished, Shaw typed for a few moments, then said, "Did you investigate the source of the sound?" "No." "Did you attempt to open any panels?" "No." "Did the knocking continue after you returned to Chamber 3? "No." She nodded once, as if I had completed a form. "Good. That's it? That's the procedure." I looked from her to Marek, who stood near the back wall with his arms folded, pale and unreadable. "Yo, can someone explain what happened?" Shaw considered me for a second. "You exceeded solitary exposure. In an inactive test chamber." "Yes." "And that causes what? Auditory disturbances?" "Sometimes." "What does that mean?" "It means you should not do it again." Her refusal to elaborate had an ugly effect on me. It made me want, perversely, to reclaim control through skepticism. People who speak in half-truths depend on your willingness to fill the gaps with their preferred fear. I had built entire funding rounds around that principle. I knew how much power lived in mystery maintained with confidence. So I latched onto the explanation that cost me the least. Stress response, suggestibility, the climate, isolation. Marek had frightened me with his behavior. The knocks had arrived at exactly the right moment to complete the effect, and none of it had to mean more than that. And yet... While Shaw filed the report, I drifted toward the temperature logs for Chamber 3. A flag deviation glowed in yellow on the hourly graph. "Hold on," I said. "Why is there a drop logged at 23:18? Shaw turned her head. "Transient anomaly." The chamber wasn't running a program. It dropped 3.4 degrees for 14 seconds, then corrected. I checked my watch memory. 23:18 had been the moment just before I found Marek facing the wall. Why didn't an alarm go off? Threshold was not reached. I scrolled back. The dip wasn't dramatic, but it was distinct, a clean notch in an otherwise flat line. Below the graph, the software listed probable causes, sensor lag, temporary seal variation, and an unplanned airflow shift. What does transient anomaly usually mean here? I asked. Shaw rose from her chair. "It means the chamber is not your concern anymore tonight." She took a printed form from the tray, signed it, and clipped it to the incident binder. That should have been the end of the matter. Instead, as she turned away, she said without looking at me, "If you hear knocking again, count before you react." I stared at her. "Count what? How many taps?" Then she left the room. Marek and I finished the shift in near silence. He worked with the same careful precision as before, but there was something different now. A minute withholding, as if part of his attention had withdrawn from shared space and gone somewhere else. Twice I caught him pausing in front of reflective surfaces. Once at a dark monitor I almost asked what he was looking for, and he lifted his eyes before I spoke. "Not now," he said. That answer sat with me all the way to morning. I should have slept after the shift, but adrenaline and irritation kept me awake. I made coffee in the empty canteen, opened the incident binder when no one was around, and read what I could. Entries were going back 8 months. Most were mundane. Condensation irregularities, faulty latch sensors, chamber program delays, and one case of vent icing in Surface B. But every so often a line would appear with the same stripped-down language Shaw had used with me. Auditory event in the CH2 corridor. Logged, no investigation. Partner visual lapse reported in testing wing. No pursuit. Uncommanded thermal descent recovered before threshold. Night technician reassigned after protocol drift. Protocol drift. That phrase bothered me more than the rest because it sounded like an institutional euphemism for behavior no one wanted to name. At the bottom of one page, beside an incident from 6 weeks earlier, someone had written in blue ink, "Do not separate them again." Not signed, not initialed, just there. I heard footsteps behind me and shut the binder. It was a woman I'd seen once in admin, heavy coat unzipped over scrubs, holding a paper cup. Her badge read Dana Kujawa, Medical. She glanced at the binder, then at me. "You're the new night tech." "That obvious? You have the look." She took sugar packets from a dispenser. "Still trying to make this place add up? Does it?" She smiled without warmth. "Not for free." I almost asked her about the rules, the logs, and Marek. Instead, I said, "What's protocol drift?" She tore open a packet. "It depends who says it. And if you say it, it means people start adapting to conditions that should remain abnormal." She stirred her coffee. "That's when management gets nervous. Conditions like hearing things in the walls?" Dana looked at me fully then. For the first time since I had arrived, I saw naked caution in someone else's face. Did Marek leave you alone? Briefly. She inhaled once through her nose, slow and controlled, then dropped the empty sugar packet into the trash. Don't let him do that again. Marek or management? Her gaze flicked toward the corridor behind me. You're asking the wrong question. She walked out before I could stop her. The rest of the day I spent trying to convince myself that the facility's culture was the actual problem. Isolation breeds ritual. Ritual breeds superstition. When once enough people buy into a system of warnings and half-explanations, every odd noise becomes evidence. But that theory depended on everyone behaving like frightened humans. That nig, Marek met me outside testing with a new timer in his hand. Mine jammed, he said. I glanced at the old one clipped to his belt. You carry a spare? Yes. He set the timer with his thumb, handed it to me, and waited until I clipped it to my pocket. Why do you avoid reflections? I asked. His expression didn't change. I don't. You absolutely do. He considered denying it, then seemed to decide against wasting the effort. Sometimes there's a delay. In mirrors? In whatever notices us. The casual way he said it stripped the room of warmth. You keep saying things like that, I said. And I can't tell if you're trying to warn me or sound insane. That used to bother me too. He turned and headed into the corridor. I followed because standing still suddenly felt like choosing a side in an argument I did not understand. Halfway to Chamber 2, a soft knock came from somewhere inside the wall at my right shoulder. 1, 2, 3. Marek did not look at me. Keep walking. I did, not because I believed him yet, because I had begun to suspect that disbelief was being counted as participation. The second set of rules found me while I was trying to prove to myself that the first set had a rational basis. That was the humiliating thing about Halcyon. Every attempt to drag it back into the territory of ordinary danger only seemed to uncover some older layer of fear beneath the official one. And it happened at 2:11 on my 7th night. Chamber 5 had thrown a recurring pressure fault, so Marek stayed behind to swap a sensor housing while I went to control for a replacement module. Shaw was supposed to be there. The room was empty. Not empty in the normal sense either. Empty in that recently abandoned way where a chair is pulled back too far from a desk, and a mug still releases a faint ribbon of heat into the air. One monitor showed the site map. Another displayed environmental readouts. A third had frozen on a grainy corridor feed that seemed to shimmer when I looked at it too long. I found the replacement module in a lower cabinet and while straightening up hit my knee on the underside of the main desk hard enough to make me curse. The impact shook something loose. A folded strip of paper taped beneath the desk, eardropped onto the floor between my boots. I picked it up expecting maybe a maintenance note. Instead, I found a sheet torn from a yellow legal pad folded into quarters, says and covered in cramped handwriting. Not one hand, several layered over one another. Some words rewritten in darker ink, entire lines crossed out so hard the paper had nearly torn. At the top, someone had written, "Official rules are for reports, these are for nights." Below that, 1. The 10-minute limit is wrong. It starts counting when IT notices you. Crossed out note beneath, sometimes sooner if you speak first. 2. The knocking is not inside the walls, it is behind them. Besides that, in different handwriting, no, it's using the walls. Don't personify it. Then below both arguments, do not open panels. 3. If your partner leaves, do not follow them, and that may not be them anymore. Underneath, faint and nearly illegible. If they come back too quickly, don't let them stand behind you. 4. The cold is not a malfunction, it is how it moves. The next lines had been crossed out and rewritten so many times that I had to angle the paper toward the lamp. 5. If it uses your voice, you waited too long. 6. If it knows a name you did not say aloud, do not answer any question. 7. Stillness helps it count. 8. Heat slows the room, not the thing. At the bottom, where signatures might have been, there were only initials and dates. Some dates had been scribbled over. One ended 6 months before my arrival. I read the page twice, then a third time, each pass making it feel less like a prank and more like evidence from a failed experiment. The last line sat apart from the rest. He'd written down the margin as if added during a final burst of panic. If Marek tells you to run, run even if he is smiling. The door behind me whispered open. I spun so fast the paper tore in my hand. Marek stood there holding the replacement module I had supposedly come to retrieve. He looked first at me, then at the note. "You weren't supposed to find that one," he said. My pulse hammered once against my throat. "How many are there?" He closed the door. "Different versions." "Who wrote them?" "People who lasted long enough to compare notes." "Compare notes on what?" He didn't answer immediately, and in that pause I saw something I had missed before. Not superstition, not devotion, but fatigue. Old fatigue, the kind that accumulates when fear becomes repetitive enough to pass for procedure. "On contradictions," he said at last. On what changed?" I held up the note. "You knew about this?" "Yes. And nobody thought to mention that the official rules were basically estimates? They're stable estimates." I laughed once, sharp and ugly. "Stable estimates are not a phrase anybody sane uses." "No," he said, "not after a while." I wanted to accuse him of participating in some elaborate institutional hazing or psychological experiment. I wanted a neat fraud to be angry at. But the paper in my hand felt too worn for theater. People don't write like that unless they've been frightened repeatedly in ways bureaucracy cannot absorb. "Who is it?" I asked. Marek's eyes shifted to the frozen corridor feed on the monitor. For a second, I thought the image there had changed, though I couldn't have said how. "We don't know," he said. "That's not good enough. It's what I have." "Is it a person?" "No." "Was it a person?" His jaw tightened. "That's one of the arguments." "Arguments?" "Shaw thinks it's environmental, a field effect. Something tied to low-temperature resonance in the old foundation. Dana thinks it attaches to memory because it behaves differently with different people. I think calling it anything too specific makes people careless." I folded the note slowly. "So what exactly does management think you're doing down here? Maintenance? Or feeding an entity in the walls data until it learns to wear people right?" At that, his gaze snapped back to mine. "Don't say things like that in control." "Why?" "Because this room listens badly." That was so absurd, so perfectly tuned to the facility's style of opaque terror, and that for one mad second I nearly laughed again. Instead, I felt the skin between my shoulders tighten. "Shaw knows all of this," I said. "Yes." "And she keeps handing out the 4 corporate rules?" "Yes." "Why?" "Because those are the only ones legal to print. There are answers so dry they become more frightening than hysteria. That was one of them." I slipped the note into my pocket. "I'm keeping this." Marek nodded, as if that had been inevitable. "Then read the back." I turned it over. More handwriting. Smaller. "Do not go to the sublevel if the elevator arrives already open." Below that, one final line. "The vault was here first. The facility was built around it." The corridor feed on the monitor twitched. Something pale seemed to move across the camera. Not crossing from one side to the other, but unfolding outward from the image itself, as if frost were blooming on the inside of the lens. Marek shut the monitor off. "We need to go," he said. "Go where?" "Anywhere we are not standing still." That line lodged somewhere deep and uncomfortable in me. I followed him back into the corridor, note crackling in my pocket like contraband. The walls hummed softly on either side. Overhead, the vents carried a draft cold enough to sting the inside of my nose. Officially, the rules had been typed, laminated, filed, and signed. The real rules had been hidden under a desk by people who had run out of sanctioned ways to warn each other. That was the moment my fear changed shape. Before, I had been worried about an event. Now I understood I had entered a system of failed explanations, and those are much harder to survive. For the next 2 nights, I stopped trying to understand Halcyon as a place and started studying it as a pattern. That felt more natural to me. I had spent years surviving on the illusion that systems could always be gamed if you watched them closely enough. Investors, audits, product demos, regulatory gaps, everything had seams. You found the hidden incentives, the tolerated lies, the speed at which other people got lazy, and you built your safety there. So I watched. I stopped asking Marek direct questions because he rarely answered them cleanly, and because I began to suspect the act of naming things aloud mattered more here than it should. Instead, I logged behaviors. I marked times. I wrote notes in a pocket pad I kept tucked inside my sleeve. Knocking occurs most often after a solitude event. An uncommanded cold precedes sound by 1 to 3 minutes. Marek checks reflections after corridor shifts. Possible visual lag? Shaw avoids CH4 entirely during nights. Dana never enters testing alone. Patterns emerged, but only sideways, never in the generous way real science offers. The knocking did seem to correlate with isolation. Temperature drops frequently appeared before alarms registered them, and people, especially people who had been here longest, developed little workarounds that weren't on any sheet. Shaw never stood with her back to a chamber door. Dana hummed under her breath when crossing the junction between testing and surface, the same 5-note sequence every time. Once I asked why. She said, "To hear if anything hums back." Marek, I noticed, had a habit of answering immediately if I spoke his name. Not thoughtfully, instantly, as if delay itself had become suspect. That was the detail that made the handwritten warning about partners bite deeper. Never trust a partner who pauses before answering. Whoever had written that hadn't meant conversational awkwardness. They had meant timing, lag. The tiny fraction of wrongness I had seen in Marek's eyes outside Chamber 3. On my 9th night, I saw him in front of the frost-covered window at the end of Corridor D. The window looked out onto one of the exterior service yards, though most nights there was nothing to see beyond the floodlights but pale ground and dark weather moving across it. Marek stood so still I thought for a second he might be asleep on his feet. His face was turned toward the glass. Frost had crept inward from the edges in feathery white veins. "What are you doing?" I asked, and he lifted one finger for silence. Against all reason, I obeyed. At first I heard nothing except the air system, then faintly from beyond the glass, or perhaps from within it, I caught the suggestion of a voice. Not words, more like the cadence of speech heard through 3 closed doors. Marek leaned closer. "It's outside tonight." My skin tightened along my arms. "What is?" He looked at me with naked irritation. "Don't ask that while looking at a window." That night I made my own rules, not because I thought I understood the threat better than anyone else, because the official rules were clearly incomplete, to the hidden ones caused panic. I needed something usable. Something built from observation rather than institutional caution or superstition. I wrote them in block letters on the back page of my pad. My rules: 1. You never stay in one place after hearing a knock. 2. Never answer a voice that repeats your words back to you. 3. If your partner pauses before responding, move where you can see reflective surfaces from more than one angle. 4. If the temperature drops suddenly, keep walking. 5. Do not let curiosity decide direction. The fifth rule was for me more than the place. Halcyon encouraged curiosity the way deep water does, by concealing the scale of what might answer it. I tested the rules in small ways. When a knock came from the wall outside Chamber 2, I did not stop to count. I changed direction immediately, cutting through a side corridor to the loading alcove. The air there felt warmer by maybe 2 degrees. The second knock did not follow. When a cold draft spilled from a vent without any corresponding shift on the nearby gauge, I kept moving instead of checking the panel. The feeling of pressure behind my ears, something I had started noticing during uncommanded temperature drops, eased after 30 steps. Most importantly, when Marek answered my name one night with a brief but unmistakable delay, I did not ask him to repeat himself. I walked backward until I could see him in the convex safety mirror at the corridor bend as well as directly in front of me. In the mirror, his mouth moved a fraction before the sound reached me. That might have been acoustics. Might have been. But his reflection blinked after he did. I kept walking. He followed for 5 paces, then stopped and said, in a tired, almost approving voice, "Good." That should have comforted me. It didn't. Because something else was changing too, and the facility no longer felt like it was reacting according to a fixed set of conditions. It felt responsive, curious, as if my adjustments had not hidden me so much as introduced me. The first time I truly believed that, I was in Surface A getting coffee around 4 in the morning. The wing was empty. Stormlight pressed dull and blue against the reinforced windows. I was alone long enough to notice the silence settle. Then from the kitchen wall behind the vending machine, I heard a soft knock. 3 taps. I stepped sideways immediately, pulse jumping. A second knock came from the opposite wall. Then a third from the ceiling above the table where I had been about to sit. It had triangulated the still point. I backed into the corridor and kept moving until I found Dana at the med station, and she took one look at my face and shut the chart in her hands. "It started following the new paths, didn't it?" she said. I nodded. She looked unsurprised. "It always does." "Then why bother with rules at all?" "Because adaptation is slower than panic." She opened a drawer and handed me a chemical heat pack. "And slower is the closest thing this place has to mercy." I squeezed the pack until it warmed in my palm. "What happens if it catches up completely?" Dana's expression did something strange then. Not fear. Not exactly, more like resignation polluted by guilt. "That," she said, "depends on what it thinks you're for." She would not say more. By then the language around Halcyon had begun infecting mine. Catch up, notices, uses. Words I would once have mocked. Words that granted intention to something I could not prove existed. But once a place forces you into predictive behavior, semantics stop mattering. You don't need certainty to adapt. Only consequence. So I adapted. I kept moving after knocks. I distrusted delay. I mapped warm zones. I refused to stand with my back to insulated walls. I stopped speaking my own history aloud, even in private. And still, somewhere under all that caution, a smaller, uglier confidence remained. I thought I was learning faster than I was. That was the last harmless lie I got to keep. The first time it used my voice, I nearly answered. That embarrassed me afterward more than the fear did. I had spent days telling myself I was observant, adaptive, careful in ways the facility's older staff had failed to be, and all it took was the sound of my own tone, pitched just right to make me turn. And it happened in the service corridor outside Chamber 1 just after midnight. Marek was 10 feet ahead of me, checking a status panel. The air had that wrong kind of cold again, not severe, just deliberate, as if the temperature were choosing joints and hollows rather than filling space evenly. I heard the first knock from somewhere behind the insulation at knee height. 3 taps. I shifted away automatically. Then my voice said, from behind the wall to my left, "Marek?" Not an imitation in the theatrical sense, not a monster's parody. It sounded exactly like the way I'd said his name earlier that evening when asking for a wrench, same tired upward tilt at the end, same dryness in the throat. I turned before I could stop myself. Marek's hand clamped around my sleeve hard enough to hurt. "Don't!" My own voice came again, in this time from ahead of us behind the sealed panel by the corner. "Marek, wait!" That was enough for me to know it wasn't an echo. The second version had urgency in it that I hadn't felt when I'd first spoken. It wasn't repeating anymore. It was iterating. We moved quickly into control. Shaw locked the door behind us and looked from one face to the other. "It used him," Marek said. Shaw swore softly, the first unguarded thing I had heard from her. "What does that mean?" I asked. "What does using my voice mean?" "It means," she said, "you gave it enough structure to start trying variations." I laughed then, a short, unbelieving noise. "Structure? What is this thing, a language model in the drywall?" Neither of them smiled. "You keep wanting a metaphor that makes it smaller," Shaw said. There isn't one." That conversation should have ended there. Instead, I made the mistake of pushing. "How long has this been going on?" No answer. "How many people heard themselves before they—" I couldn't finish cleanly because I still didn't know the acceptable verb. Disappeared, changed, lagged. Shaw folded her arms. "Long enough that the facility predates everyone currently employed here. That doesn't answer the question. It answers the useful portion of it." Marek said quietly, "You should sleep in Surface B tonight." I looked at him. "Why B? Surface A is closer to the old foundation." "The old foundation under what?" "The vault," Shaw said. There it was again. That word nobody explained unless forced. Not storage, not inventory. The vault, as if capital letters could make secrecy feel geological. I should have demanded more, and instead I agreed to move bunks because fatigue had started eroding the edge off my anger. Fear does that after a while. It makes compliance feel like choosing your own idea. Surface B was a narrower dorm wing above medical, warmer and less used. Dana left a thermal blanket on the bunk for me without comment. Before she walked out, she hesitated in the doorway. "Whatever it says," she told me, "if it starts talking like it knows you, remember that it only knows what gets through." "What gets through from where?" She looked at me for so long I felt suddenly exposed. "That depends on what you brought in with you." After she left, I sat on the bunk with the handwritten rules and my own notes spread beside me. I don't know why I started thinking about Caleb then. Maybe because exhaustion weakens the partitions you keep in yourself. Maybe because Halcyon had trained me to hear every caution as conditional. The truth about Albany was simpler and worse than the legal version. We were behind schedule, investors were visiting. I had signed off on the pressure manifold inspection without running the final test because I was certain the actual engineer had already done it. And because I needed that certainty to be true for another 48 hours. Caleb asked me twice if I wanted him to delay the demonstration. I told him no. After the rupture, while alarms screamed and coolant fog filled the bay, he tried to help me shut down the housing manually. That was when the secondary line gave way. He died because I treated the procedure like a narrative, something that could be massaged if the ending needed help. I had never said any of that at Halcyon, not aloud, not to Shaw, or Donna or Marek or myself in any full sentence. At 3:17, the vent above my bunk knocked once. Just once. I stood up so fast that the blanket hit the floor. Then Marek's voice said from inside the vent, calm and close, "Evan, don't move." I moved immediately, backing into the corridor. The voice continued, now from behind the wall near the washroom. It counts better when you run. My heart was slamming hard enough to blur my vision. Dana's office light glowed at the far end of the hall. I started toward it. Then another voice came from the vent overhead. My voice. You told Caleb the housing had passed. I stopped. It is difficult to explain the violence of hearing your most private guilt spoken aloud by something that should not know the shape of your life. Not because it sounded demonic, because it sounded informed. You told him to stop shaking, it said. You said the needle drift was normal. My knees nearly gave out. I had told Caleb that. Not word for word, maybe, but close enough. Close enough that my body understood before my mind did that this was not random mimicry. It had not merely learned my voice. It had learned where to place the blade. Dana opened her office door at the sound of me hitting the wall with one hand. She took one look at my face and dragged me inside, shutting the door hard enough to rattle the frame. A portable heater hummed in the corner. The room smelled like antiseptic and burnt dust. It's using content now, she said, not asking. How does it know? She didn't answer. I grabbed the edge of her desk. How does it know that? Dana's own fear slipped then, just for a second. And because this place doesn't just test materials, she said. It records responses, thermal, neurological, behavioral. It was built to study stress in extreme environments. Then somebody realized the old foundation was studying back. I stared at her. The chambers amplify certain conditions, she went on, voice tightening with disgust. Isolation, cold, deprivation, attention. Whatever is down there became easier to observe, then easier to provoke, and once people understood it, responded differently to different subjects. She stopped. They kept going, I said. Yes. Why? Because institutions call it research when the room learns faster than the ethics board. The vent in her office knocked 3 times. Then in Caleb's voice, though I had not heard Caleb speak in more than a year, it said very softly, You left me there. Dana went white. I ran. Not because of the voice itself, because I finally understood that whatever had lived beneath Halcyon was no longer just repeating patterns from the building. It was reaching into us, sorting, selecting, and testing which truths made us stop moving. And it had found mine. The final shift began before the shift officially started. At 1840, an hour before night handoff, every unoccupied chamber in the testing wing dropped 6 degrees at once. No command initiated it. No program queue accounted for it. The temperature graphs bent downward in neat, simultaneous arcs, as if a single hand had pressed on the entire building. The alarms didn't trigger until after the descent had already bottomed out and stabilized. By then, the frost had started appearing in places that should have remained warm. Around the hinges of surface doors, along the railings in the central corridor, on the inside of the observation glass in control. Shaw called all available night staff in early. That meant Marek, me, Dana, and one maintenance electrician I'd only met twice. A broad man named Luis who kept glancing at the walls as though expecting them to remember him. Nobody pretended this was procedural. Shaw shut the control room door and spoke in the curt, clipped cadence of someone using command voice to keep panic from becoming social. Temperature descent is site-wide. Exterior communications are down. The elevator to the sub-level is unresponsive. Door seals are stiffening. We stay paired. No one follows a voice source. No one opens any insulated panel for any reason. Luis said, "What about the tunnel?" My head snapped toward him. What tunnel? Shaw ignored the question. If you lose line of sight with your partner, a knock interrupted her. Then another. Then another. Not one source. Multiple. All around us, walls, ceiling, floor, so synchronized that for a second it sounded like rain striking the building from the inside. No one spoke. The knocking stopped all at once. The lights dimmed and returned weaker. Shaw exhaled slowly. We're past containment phase. I looked at her. Containment? That got me the truth at last, maybe because events had outrun policy. The facility was not built to study a phenomenon, she said. It was built over one. The original structure was military. Permafrost excavation, acoustic anomalies, personnel drift, in disappearances. Private contractors took it over when the site proved responsive to environmental stimuli. The chambers weren't just for clients. They were a way to localize behavior, to slow the spread, to map thresholds. You said this place was for testing. It is, she said, but not only for what's on the invoices. Luis laughed once under his breath, not because anything was funny. We trained it. No one contradicted him. The next 10 minutes dissolved into motion. Corridor doors began freezing in their frames. The HVAC pushed air so cold it felt granular in the lungs. A sheet of ice spread over the interior window of Chamber 2 in a pattern that looked horribly like branching veins. We tried to maintain pairs. That lasted until the building decided otherwise. And the first separation happened when the lights in the east spine failed and emergency shutters dropped between zones. Marek shoved me through a narrowing gap just before the panel slammed down, sealing him on the other side. I hit the floor hard, scrambled up, and heard him shout my name through the metal. Go to Surface B. Open it. Go! The panel knocked from the inside, not his side, mine. I backed away. The corridor temperature display read 11 degrees Fahrenheit and was falling. My rules, not theirs, rose in me then. Keep moving after the knock. Don't answer repeated voices. Cold means motion. Curiosity kills direction. I ran west toward surface access. Halfway there, I saw frost spiraling along the walls in active motion, not growing so much as searching over the paint in thin, exploratory fingers. The vents chattered with soft impacts, and doors I had used 100 times now resisted like dead weight. Somewhere behind me, the building groaned, the long, low structural complaint of materials surrendering to thermal stress. Then Marek stepped into the hall ahead of me. Or something wearing his arrangement did. He stood under a failing light with one hand loosely at his side, head slightly bowed. His face was perfectly composed, too composed. Some smiles revealed joy, malice, or performance. He revealed his vacancy. It spread too evenly as if pulled by wires beneath the skin. You don't have to run anymore, he said. His voice arrived from his mouth and a beat later from the vent above me. You can stay. My body tried to stop. That was the most dangerous part. Not fear, relief. The seduction of ending motion, ending decisions, ending the humiliating effort of resisting something larger than your understanding. Then I remembered the note under the desk. If Marek tells you to run, run even if he is smiling. I veered hard into a side maintenance passage without answering. The passage was narrow, lined with pipes wrapped in insulation. The temperature there rose slightly, not warm, but survivable. I kept one hand on the wall to steady myself around blind turns. Knocking followed from somewhere inside the pipe chase, changing pace to match my steps. Then it got clever. Evan, Shaw's voice said from behind me, breathless. Wait! I didn't. Mercer! Louise shouted from ahead. Wrong way! I didn't. Please, Caleb said softly from the wall to my right. It hurts to keep moving. I made a sound then, half curse, half animal, and ran faster. And the maintenance passage emptied into a ladder well I had never been shown on any site map. The air rising from below felt impossibly cold. The air above smelled faintly of diesel and old rust. Tunnel, I thought. Luis had said tunnel. The ladder rungs burned through my gloves with cold. I climbed up, 2 floors, 3. At the top, a service hatch stood half open, rimmed with thick white frost. That should have warned me. The back of the note flashed through my mind. Do not go to the sublevel if the elevator arrives already open. This wasn't an elevator, but it was an opening presented to me, ready and waiting in the middle of a building that now felt actively predictive. I hesitated. The knocking behind me went silent. That silence frightened me more than any sound. I climbed back down. At the base of the ladder, in a narrow door I hadn't seen before, stood slightly ajar, warm vapor leaking through the crack. Real warmth, mechanical warmth, generator heat. I shoved through. The room beyond housed old utility pumps and an emergency snowcat bay, one concrete chamber opening directly to an exterior blast door. The door was halfway unfrozen, hydraulic arms straining against a buildup of ice. Beside the controls stood Shaw. She looked at me with something like disappointment, which was somehow worse than relief. "You found the live exit," she said. "You knew this was here." "Yes." "You were going to leave us?" "I was going to keep the spread from reaching the surface if I could." The knocking started again then, all around the bay, louder than ever. The pumps vibrated, frost raced over the concrete in branching white fans. From the corridor behind me, Marek's voice said, perfectly calm, "Don't let him go." Shaw hit the door override. Nothing. She hit it again. The blast door jerked 6 inches upward, then stalled. "It's freezing the hydraulics," she said. "Move!" I grabbed the emergency release lever beside her and threw my full weight on it. Something in my shoulder popped. The hydraulic lock screamed. The door lurched another foot. Enough. Cold night air knifed through the opening. Shaw shoved a thermal pack into my hand so hard it hurt. "If you stop somewhere enclosed, it'll build around you again." "You're coming?" She looked past me toward the dark corridor where voices had begun layering over one another. Mine, Marek's, Dana's, and others I didn't know, all trying different tones, different urgencies. "No," she said. "Somebody has to close it behind you. Shaw, go." I went, and that still shames me a little, though shame has become a luxury emotion in the months since. I dropped to my knees and crawled under the half-open blast door into black wind and crusted white ground. The snowcat sat buried to its hubs under frost growth, but its cabin door was free. Behind me, just before I slammed the cab shut, I saw Marek reach the inside of the blast bay. He was smiling, and behind him, through the open corridor, the walls moved. Not metaphorically, not with shadows. The frost itself advanced in pale vertical waves, gathering and redistributing as if the facility had been full all along, with something trying different ways to stand up. I started the snowcat on the 3rd try and drove blind into the dark. I never saw Halcyon collapse. In the mirror, for a long time, it looked like the lights were still on. I made it out. That is the cleanest sentence available, and I distrust it more every week. The road south was closed in 2 places, so I ditched the snowcat at a county maintenance depot and lied my way into a ride with a plow driver who took one look at my facility badge, my frost-burned hands, and the condition of my face, and decided not to ask questions he didn't want answered. By noon, I was in a motel 40 miles away under a false name, sitting on a bedspread patterned with faded red squares while the heater rattled in the wall unit like bad teeth. I stayed there 19 minutes. At minute 20, the heater knocked 3 times from inside the casing. I left my coat, my toothbrush, and half the cash on the dresser. Since then, I've kept moving. Bus stations, cheap motels, overnight trains. Apartment sublets are rented week to week through people who don't care what name is on your ID as long as the money clears. I tell myself I'm staying ahead of lawsuits, investigators, the last hard edges of the life I wrecked before Halcyon. That explanation still sounds sensible enough to pass in conversation. The truer explanation is simpler. I no longer remain anywhere enclosed long enough to feel claimed by it. Officially, Halcyon Ridge does not exist in any public registry I can find now. The payroll company that issued my deposits dissolved into another shell a week after I fled. The phone numbers I saved for Shaw and Dana returned disconnected messages. Once, from a library computer in Ohio, I found a cached procurement document referencing a cold environment annex outside Fairbanks under a different name. When I tried to open the attachment, the browser froze, and the monitor dimmed until my reflection looked a fraction late. I walked out before the librarian could object. I've spent a lot of nights thinking about what Shaw said in the blast bay, and what Luis said before that. We trained it. That is the line I keep circling because it makes too much of my survival make sense. If Halcyon had only been containing something, my leaving would feel like escape. But the chambers, the partner rules, the false paperwork, the steady narrowing of safe behaviors, those were not just barriers, they were conditions, repetitions, controlled exposures. A curriculum in how attention worked, how fear moved, how memory could be selected, mimicked, sharpened into leverage. The cold was part of that once. Maybe the original part. Maybe whatever sat beneath the old foundation needed low temperature, the way an engine needs fuel. But what if the facility solved that problem for it? What if years of forced interaction taught it how to persist through other vectors? Voice, timing, recognition, the small neurological hitch that makes one person pause a half-second too long before answering another. I think about Marek often. That surprises me less now than it would have before. We never became friends. He was too withholding, and I was too busy deciding other people's caution meant weakness. But in the end, he gave me the only honest kind of protection available in that place. Warnings I would have mocked if he'd delivered them sooner, and a final command shouted through a closing panel. Sometimes I wonder whether the Marek who smiled in the blast bay was already gone hours earlier. Sometimes I wonder whether the real one had been disappearing in fractions for years. Dana visits my thoughts, tease too, usually when I catch myself treating institutions as neutral machinery again. Halcyon did not become what it was by accident. People kept making choices inside it. People gave contracts a euphemistic language and called thresholds research. A&D taught themselves not to ask whether a thing that learns from distress should ever be given structured access to more of it. That part frightens me almost as much as the knocks now, because it means the worst intelligence in the story may not be the one in the walls. I've noticed patterns since leaving. At first they were small. Hotel room temperatures are dropping a degree just before dawn without any HVAC cycle. Frost formed on the inside edges of the U.S. windows while other passengers slept. The sensation in certain hallways that the building had become interested in whether I would stop at the bend or keep moving. Then the people started happening. A cashier in Nebraska paused halfway through handing me change, her fingers tightening around the coins as if she had forgotten what a hand was for. When she looked up, her eyes aligned a fraction after her face. By the time fear reached my throat, she blinked and finished the motion, apologizing that she was tired. A man at a laundromat in Missouri stood with his palm resting lightly against the dryer door for so long I nearly left my clothes. Then he turned and smiled at no one in particular before going back to folding shirts. A little girl in the seat ahead of me on a night bus tapped 3 times on the plastic panel by the window, then looked back and asked in my own voice, "Are you getting off here?" I did. I don't know whether it is following me or whether I am only good now at noticing the places it has already reached. I don't know whether Halcyon failed containment or completed some stage of it. I don't know whether the thing in the walls wants bodies, memories, stillness, or simply repetition until every environment becomes another version of the first room where it learned to count. What I do know is this: the cold is less necessary now. That was the conclusion I kept resisting because once I let it settle, All the smaller incidents stopped looking like paranoia and started arranging themselves into a method. At first, I still tried to test reality the way I used to test investors, by looking for inconsistencies, by assuming fear exaggerated the data. I bought cheap thermometers from hardware stores in 3 different states. I started keeping a new notebook, cleaner than the first, with dates, times, and locations. I logged every unexplained drop in temperature, every knock, every person whose movement lagged half a beat behind itself. The numbers didn't comfort me. In enclosed spaces, yes, the temperature still dipped before anything else happened. But in open places, in bus depots and laundromats and all-night diners, the pattern changed. People stalled first. A conversation hesitation. A strange stillness at the edge of a room. Attention fixed on nothing visible. Then the environment followed, not with a full drop in heat, but with little local failures. Condensation where there shouldn't be any. Frost at the lip of a drink glass in a heated room. Breath is briefly visible indoors. It was as if the cold had stopped being its body and become only its accent. 3 weeks after I left Halcyon, I rented a room above a garage in Duluth under the name Aaron Pike. The landlord never looked closely at my ID, and the room had 2 windows, poor insulation, and an exterior stairwell I could leave from without crossing the house. By my standards, it was almost luxurious. I lasted 4 nights. At first, nothing happened. On the second, the pipes knocked once at 2:03 a.m. and then went quiet. On the third, I woke because I had dreamed of Chamber 3 again. Only in the dream Caleb was inside, not Merrick, and he kept tapping on the insulated panel with the calm patience of someone waiting to be admitted to a meeting. I sat up, sweating, and saw my breath in the dark. The room thermostat read 68. The 4th night was worse because it was almost ordinary. I came back from a grocery store around midnight with soup, batteries, and a duffel bag I'd started keeping half-packed by the door. The landlord's grandson, maybe 10 years old, was sitting on the back steps in a winter coat too big for him, bouncing a rubber ball once against the concrete every few seconds. When I passed, he looked up and asked, "Do you live in a cold place?" I stopped. "What?" "The cold place," he said again, as if I were being difficult. The one that follows you." The ball hit the step, once, twice, 3 times. He smiled after the 3rd bounce, not maliciously, just vaguely, the way children smile when they've repeated something they don't understand but know is important. I dropped the groceries right there and went back upstairs to pack. By dawn, I was gone. That was when I stopped asking whether it was following me. The better question was whether I was teaching it by continuing to run in recognizable ways. If Halcyon had trained it, then my panic might be doing postgraduate work. That idea changed things. I stopped following highways and straight lines. I changed cities without rhythm. I avoided routine stops, avoided familiar chain motels, and avoided any room with a single exit. I began choosing spaces where movement was easy, and angles were generous, train stations, diners with multiple doors, 24-hour supermarkets, hospital waiting rooms when I could get away with it. I hated what that made me. I had spent years running from debt, blame, and legal consequences. Now I was also choosing places based on line of sight and exit geometry, sleeping in bursts, eating standing up, leaving half-finished coffees because a vent made a sound in the wrong cadence. Survival narrows you. It makes your principles look decorative, but it also sharpens certain truths. Here is one I came to accept. The thing from Halcyon did not want me dead in any simple sense. If it had, there had been easier chances. No. It wanted interruption, compliance. The arrested moment when a person stopped moving long enough to be measured against themselves. And that was what I saw in all the others, the cashier, the laundromat man, the boy on the steps. Not possession as movies describe it, more like overwrite, A brief competing draft of the person trying the body on for timing, which meant the smiles mattered. So did the pauses. So did the slight delay of the eyes. In January, I finally made the mistake I'd been orbiting since I fled. I tried to go back, not all the way. I told myself I only wanted proof. A photograph of the roadblock, a deed record, a county utility map. Anything concrete enough to anchor the last months to the physical world and not my deteriorating nerves. I rented a truck in Anchorage with cash, drove north under a sky so colorless it made every object look pre-abandoned, and got within 50 miles of where Halcyon should have been before the weather came in. And it wasn't a storm at first, just a hardening of the air. Then the dashboard thermometer dropped 11 degrees in less than a minute. The radio hissed and cut out. The windshield frosted from the edges inward, though the defroster was on full. Ahead of me, through the whitening glass, I saw a figure standing in the road. Marek. At least that was what my mind supplied instantly. Same build, same posture, one hand slightly open at his side. I hit the brakes and the truck fishtailed half into the ditch. The figure didn't move. I should have reversed. I should have turned around immediately and driven south until the road ran out. Instead, I sat there with my hands locked on the wheel and watched as the figure slowly raised its head. Even through the storm-softened distance, I could tell the eyes were wrong. Not glowing, not black, just late. Then through the truck's dead speakers, though the radio display was blank, my own voice said, "You came back." I drove. I didn't stop for 3 hours. That finished the argument in me. Halcyon might still exist in concrete and steel, or it might be buried now or sealed or expanded under another contract number. It didn't matter. The geography was no longer the problem. The site had become portable the second it learned enough of us. So this is what I have left instead of answers. A testimony no court would want, a notebook full of patterns that look insane until you survive by them, and one final rule I trust more than any official protocol ever handed to me. I wrote it after the boy on the steps. I rewrote it after the road north. I keep it on the first page of every notebook because if I wake confused, if I wake somewhere new with frost at the window and my own name sounding wrong in the room, I need to see it immediately. Never stay in one place for too long, not because movement saves you forever. I'm no longer arrogant enough to believe in forever, but because stillness is how it takes inventory. And lately, when I pass people on sidewalks or in station corridors, I've started noticing something worse than the lag. Sometimes they look at me as if they recognize me. Not me, exactly. More like they've heard me already. A woman in Milwaukee turned her head as I passed and said under her breath, "You don't have to run anymore." A man in a pharmacy smiled while the freezer case behind him bloomed white and answered, "You can stay." Yesterday, in the restroom mirror of a bus terminal outside Cleveland, my reflection looked tired, unshaven, thinner than I remembered. I leaned toward the sink, splashed water on my face, and when I looked again, there was a fraction of a second where the man in the glass was still smiling, though I wasn't. Only a fraction, but that's all it ever needed. So if this account gets read by anyone who thinks I'm unstable, guilty, or trying to turn negligence into mythology, believe whatever version helps you sleep. I've lied for a living before. I know how stories sound when they want forgiveness. This one doesn't. This one is only a warning. If your heater knocks, don't count it. If someone answers your name too slowly, don't let them stand behind you. If the room gets cold, keep moving. And if you ever find yourself somewhere remote, somewhere corporate, somewhere full of rules that feel too polished to be honest, you leave before the place decides to teach you. Because I don't think Halcyon was the end of anything. I think it was a prototype. And now, wherever I go, I can feel it getting better.